A millionaire mocked a seamstress during a fancy party, pointing out her modest dress. She gave him a powerful lesson that left the entire crowd in awe. The chandelier in the center of the grand ballroom was a marvel of crystal and light, its cascading tears catching every gleam and reflection. Beneath it, the city's elite swirled through the room, their laughter rising like champagne bubbles to mingle with the soft strains of a string quartet. Waiters in sharp black uniforms glided silently between clusters of guests, balancing silver trays laden with glasses of vintage wine and canapes so delicate they seemed more art than food. It was Arthur Belmont's night, the annual Belmont Gala, where power and prestige were flaunted as much as the jewels adorning every wrist and neck. Arthur, the host and an undeniable figure of authority, commanded attention without trying. His tailored suit, cut to perfection, and the easy way he moved among the guests spoke of a man accustomed to admiration, even envy. Yet, even in this opulent sea of satin and silk, one presence drew every eye, not for her grandeur but for her quiet simplicity. Elena Moreau stood at the edge of the room, a soft ripple in the fabric of the evening. Her dress was modest, too modest, many would say for an event of this magnitude. Its pale blue hue, simple lines, and lack of embellishments made it a stark contrast to the elaborate gowns that surrounded her. But it fit her perfectly, hugging her slender figure with a precision that whispered of expert hands. She had crafted it herself, and every stitch carried a story. Her presence did not go unnoticed. Guests exchanged whispers behind champagne flutes, and more than one pair of eyes lingered on her, some in curiosity, others in judgment. To the untrained observer, she might have appeared an intruder in this world of privilege. But Elena was no stranger to rooms like these, even if her station was different. She was here as a guest companion, a courtesy extended by an old client who still admired her work. Arthur Belmont, however, noticed her for different reasons. From the moment she stepped into the ballroom, she became a curiosity. His sharp, calculating gaze landed on her like a spotlight, and the corners of his mouth twitched upward in amusement. With a casual sip of his whiskey, he leaned toward his companion, a fellow tycoon in the real estate world, and murmured just loudly enough, "Looks like someone missed the memo on dress codes." The words, though quiet, rippled through the nearby crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Heads turned, and laughter followed, soft and polite but pointed. Arthur's smirk deepened as he handed off his empty glass and made his way toward Elena, curiosity and a streak of mischief propelling him forward. "Elena Moreau, is it?" he began, his voice smooth as he stopped just close enough to command her attention. He extended a hand, the gesture both polite and patronizing. "Arthur Belmont, welcome to my little gathering." Elena turned to face him fully, her expression serene, though her fingers tightened around the clutch in her hand. She met his gaze with an unflinching calm that only deepened his intrigue. "Thank you, Mr. Belmont. It's a remarkable event." "Remarkable, indeed," he said, his eyes sweeping over her dress before returning to her face. "Your attire is unique. Tell me, do you design all your own clothes, or is this a special occasion?" The words were lightly spoken, almost playful, but the condescension was unmistakable. Around them, a small circle of guests had begun to form, their interest piqued by the interaction. Elena's lips curved into a faint smile as she responded, her tone steady. "I do design my own clothes. Tonight's dress is no exception. I find creating something myself ensures it carries a personal touch." Arthur chuckled, his laughter low and deliberate. "Ah, a true artisan," he said, gesturing with his hand as if her modesty required an explanation. "It must be rewarding to wear the fruits of your own labor. Though I suppose it's more practical than relying on others to curate one's wardrobe." Laughter rippled through the crowd again, though it was less certain this time. Elena's quiet composure seemed to unsettle even those enjoying Arthur's mockery. She nodded slightly, as if considering his words. "It is rewarding," she said, "but more than that, it's meaningful. There's something to be said for understanding the effort behind the things we value." Her reply hung in the air, a quiet counterpoint to Arthur's humor. For a moment, the crowd's laughter faltered, and Arthur's smirk twitched. He recovered quickly, raising his glass in a mock toast. "Well said, Ms. Morrow. You must tell me, though, what inspired you to bring such a creation to an evening like this?" Elena's smile deepened slightly, her calm now tinged with something sharper. "Inspiration comes in many forms, Mr. Belmont. Sometimes it's the challenge of crafting something beautiful with limited resources. Other times, it's the reminder that beauty isn't confined to excess." The room hushed. For the first time, Arthur seemed caught off guard. He tilted his head, his amusement dimming just enough to reveal a flicker of irritation. The crowd, sensing the shift, grew quieter, their attention fixed on the exchange. "Well," Arthur said, recovering with a practiced laugh, "you certainly have a way with words. Perhaps you should consider adding oratory to your list of talents." "Perhaps," Elena replied, her gaze steady. "But I find actions often speak louder." Arthur opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, another guest interjected, complimenting Elena's poise and asking about her work. The conversation turned briefly, and Arthur found himself observing her rather than engaging. There was something about her presence, her refusal to be cowed by his jabs, the way she turned his words back on him with quiet precision, that gnawed at him. As the evening wore on, Elena moved through the room with a quiet grace, engaging in conversations that seemed to draw genuine interest. Arthur, meanwhile, found himself watching her more closely than he intended. His initial amusement had given way to curiosity, and then to something closer to unease. She was different, yes, but not in the way he had first assumed. And the way the crowd gravitated toward her, despite, or perhaps because of, her modesty, left him unsettled. By the time the orchestra struck its final chord, and the last glasses of champagne were being poured, Arthur's mind was spinning with questions he couldn't quite articulate. Who was this woman, really? And why did her presence feel like a disruption to the carefully constructed order of his world? As Elena prepared to leave, she cast one last glance around the room, her eyes meeting Arthur's for a fleeting moment. There was no animosity in her gaze, only a quiet confidence that left him rooted in place. She turned and walked toward the exit, her modest dress blending into the shadows at the edges of the ballroom. Arthur stood motionless, his drink forgotten in his hand, as the room seemed to hum with an energy he couldn't place. Whatever had just transpired, he knew one thing for certain: Elena Moreau was not a woman to be underestimated. The energy of the gala crescendoed as the night deepened, with the band transitioning to lively jazz tunes that encouraged the guests to mingle more freely. The grand ballroom, alive with laughter and chatter, became a web of conversations where alliances were forged and reputations bolstered. Yet amidst the glittering crowd, a new focal point had emerged, a woman whose modesty both intrigued and unsettled the room. Arthur Belmont's interest in Elena Moreau had evolved from mild curiosity to something more pointed. He had always been a man who relished control, the way he could manipulate a room's attention with a well-timed remark or a flash of his charming smile. But Elena's calm defiance had disrupted the easy flow of his dominance, and it gnawed at him. He found her again near the buffet, quietly conversing with an older couple. They seemed genuinely engrossed in what she was saying, their laughter warm and unforced, a contrast to the polite chuckles Arthur so often drew from his peers. It was an unusual sight, someone of her station commanding attention in such a setting without ostentation or pedigree to back her. With a fresh glass of whiskey in hand, Arthur approached, his steps measured and deliberate. He waited until there was a lull in the conversation before interjecting, his voice smooth yet tinged with the faintest edge of condescension. "Elena, there you are. I was beginning to think you'd abandoned us for more fitting company." The older couple exchanged glances, their smiles fading as they excused themselves, sensing the tension in Arthur's tone. Elena turned to him slowly, her expression unchanging, as if his words carried no weight. "Mr. Belmont," she said evenly, "I wasn't aware you were looking for me." Arthur's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I couldn't possibly ignore the most talked-about guest of the evening. Tell me, Elena, do you always have such an interesting effect on people?" Her gaze didn't waver. "I suppose it depends on the company. A ripple of amusement passed through those nearby who had paused to listen. Arthur felt a flicker of irritation, but quickly masked it. He gestured to her dress, his tone light but calculated. "Your outfit truly is remarkable. A testament to your creativity, I'm sure. Though I wonder, does it ever feel limiting, working within such humble means?" The words hung in the air, the thinly veiled insult unmistakable. A few guests stifled chuckles, their eyes darting between Arthur and Elena like spectators at a duel. But Elena, to their surprise, didn't flinch. "I find that limitations often inspire the most creativity," she replied, her voice steady. "When every detail matters, the result is something unique. Something that tells a story." Arthur arched an eyebrow, his smile tightening. "A noble sentiment," he said, "but I do wonder, how many stories can be told without the proper resources?" "More than you might imagine," Elena said. Her tone was calm, but there was a steeliness beneath it, an unspoken challenge that seemed to draw the attention of everyone within earshot. "True artistry isn't bound by wealth, Mr. Belmont. It thrives on ingenuity and passion." For a moment, Arthur said nothing, his mind whirring. He was unused to being challenged so openly, especially by someone he considered beneath him. Around them, the crowd had grown, their curiosity piqued by the exchange. The murmurs of the party receded as more guests tuned in, the spectacle of Arthur Belmont verbally sparring with a woman of humble origins proving irresistible. "Well," Arthur said finally, his voice taking on a theatrical quality as he addressed the onlookers. "Perhaps we should put this ingenuity to the test. What do you say, Elena? A demonstration of your so-called artistry. Surely someone as confident as you wouldn't shy away from such an opportunity." Elena tilted her head slightly, her calm demeanor unwavering. "And what sort of demonstration would you suggest, Mr. Belmont?" Arthur's smirk deepened, sensing an opportunity to regain control. He gestured toward a nearby table, where several items of luxury were displayed: handcrafted jewelry, designer handbags, and intricately embroidered fabrics meant to impress the guests. "Let's see if your eye for craftsmanship is as keen as your tongue," he said. "Can you tell the difference between genuine artistry and imitation?" A murmur spread through the crowd, excitement mingling with a touch of discomfort. The proposal was unusual, even for Arthur, and its implications were clear. A chance to expose Elena, to put her expertise to the test under the scrutiny of dozens of eyes. Elena considered the challenge for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Then, to Arthur's surprise, and perhaps dismay, she smiled. "Very well," she said. "Let's begin." The crowd parted to make way as Arthur led her to the table. The air buzzed with anticipation as he selected an ornate necklace, its delicate chain and sparkling gemstones catching the light. "This piece," he said, holding it up for all to see. "What do you make of it?" Elena stepped closer, her fingers brushing lightly over the necklace as she examined it. Her movements were deliberate, her focus unwavering. After a moment, she looked up, her gaze meeting Arthur's. "It's exquisite," she said, her tone neutral, "but not original. The design is derivative, likely mass-produced to mimic true craftsmanship. The gemstones are real, but the gold is plated." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Arthur's expression faltered for a split second before he forced a laugh. "Impressive," he said, "but perhaps a lucky guess. Let's try another." He moved quickly, selecting a silk scarf with intricate embroidery. Elena took it in her hands, her fingers gliding over the fabric with practiced ease. "This is genuine," she said after a moment. "Hand-stitched, likely by a master craftsman. The pattern suggests European origins, though the silk itself is from Asia." Arthur's smile tightened as the crowd murmured their astonishment. One by one, he presented her with items, and each time, Elena's assessments were precise, her knowledge evident. What had begun as an attempt to humiliate her had turned into an unexpected showcase of her expertise, and the crowd's perception of her began to shift. By the time the final item was examined, Arthur's confidence had eroded, replaced by a simmering frustration he could no longer mask. Elena, meanwhile, stood composed, her quiet strength radiating in a way that silenced any remaining whispers of doubt. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Belmont," she said, her voice as calm as ever. "It's always a pleasure to share what I've learned." Arthur said nothing, his jaw tight as he returned the last item to the table. The crowd lingered for a moment longer before dispersing, the murmurs now carrying a tone of admiration for Elena rather than derision. As she turned to leave, Arthur watched her go, a storm of emotions churning beneath his polished exterior. He had set out to make a mockery of her, but instead, she had turned the spotlight on him, exposing the fragility of his authority in the process. For the first time that evening, Arthur Belmont felt truly uncertain. The ballroom hummed with renewed energy as Elena moved through the crowd, her earlier exchange with Arthur Belmont still lingering in the air. She could feel the weight of their gazes, some curious, others wary, and a few downright hostile. She wasn't the kind of guest the Belmont Gala was meant to host, but she had become its unexpected centerpiece. The whispers trailed her like shadows, and yet she carried herself with the quiet poise of someone who had walked through fire before. In a quiet alcove near the edge of the room, Elena found a moment to breathe. She let her fingers trace the hem of her dress absent-mindedly, feeling the stitches that she knew by heart. It wasn't just fabric to her. It was a testament to her journey, a silent reminder of where she'd been and what she had overcome. Her thoughts drifted back to another time, another place, when life had been simpler but no less demanding. Years ago, Elena had been a young seamstress in a bustling atelier on the edge of the city. The workshop was a modest place, tucked between a bakery and a cobbler, but its reputation for quality craftsmanship had drawn a loyal clientele. Elena had started as an apprentice, learning the trade under the watchful eye of Madame Renaud, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp tongue and an even sharper needle. "Elena," Madame Renaud would often say, her hands never idle as they guided fabric through a sewing machine, "precision is everything. A stitch too loose, a seam too tight, it can ruin the entire garment. Never let haste compromise your work." Elena had taken those lessons to heart, and over the years, her skill had blossomed. She became the atelier's star, known for her intricate embroidery and her ability to turn even the simplest fabric into something extraordinary. Her clients came from all walks of life. Socialites looking for bespoke gowns, brides seeking perfection for their special day, and, occasionally, people like Arthur Belmont. Arthur had been one of their wealthiest clients, a man who spared no expense in dressing for success. He had commissioned a series of tailored suits, each more elaborate than the last, and though he rarely acknowledged the hands behind their creation, he had always returned for more. Elena had stitched his initials into countless collars, her work meticulous even if unappreciated. But life in the atelier had not been without its struggles. When Madame Renaud fell ill, the workshop's fortunes declined. The debts mounted, and the clientele dwindled, drawn away by newer, flashier establishments. Elena had stayed as long as she could, working tirelessly to keep the atelier afloat, but eventually, the doors had closed for good. Madame Renaud passed away shortly after, leaving Elena with little more than her tools and her talent. In the years that followed, Elena had rebuilt her life, finding work where she could and always staying true to the principles Madame Renaud had taught her. She had learned to survive on less, to create beauty from scraps, and to carry herself with dignity even in the face of adversity. It was that resilience that had brought her to this moment, standing in Arthur Belmont's grand ballroom, unbowed by his mockery. A voice broke through her reverie, pulling her back to the present. "You've made quite the impression tonight." Elena turned to see a woman standing nearby, elegantly dressed in a deep emerald gown. Her hair was swept into an intricate updo, and her piercing blue eyes sparkled with curiosity. Elena recognized her as Margaret Sinclair, a philanthropist known for her sharp wit and her discerning taste. "I hope it was a favorable one," Elena replied, her tone polite but guarded. Margaret smiled, stepping closer. "Favorable? My dear, you've managed to do something few have ever accomplished. You've unsettled Arthur Belmont. That alone is worth noting." Elena allowed herself a small smile. "That wasn't my intention." "Perhaps not," Margaret said, her gaze thoughtful. "But you've reminded this room of something they often forget. That true value isn't always wrapped in gold." The comment hung in the air, and for a moment, Elena felt a flicker of warmth. Margaret's words were unexpected, a rare acknowledgement of her worth in a setting where appearances reigned supreme. As they spoke, the whispers around the room grew louder, their tones shifting from idle gossip to something more probing. Snatches of conversation reached Elena's ears, questions about her background, speculation about her connection to Arthur, and murmurs about the quality of her work. The room seemed to buzz with the collective need to unravel the mystery of her presence. Meanwhile, across the ballroom, Arthur Belmont stood near the bar, his drink untouched as he listened to the conversations swirling around him. He could feel the tide turning, the guests who once hung on his every word now drifting toward Elena. It was a rare feeling for Arthur, this sense of being overshadowed, and it unsettled him deeply. "Who is she, really?" someone asked, their voice cutting through the noise. "She's clearly not just a seamstress." Arthur's jaw tightened as he resisted the urge to respond. The truth was, he didn't know much about Elena Moreau, and that ignorance stung more than he cared to admit. He had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to discern their motives with ease, but Elena was an enigma. Her confidence, her poise, and her refusal to be cowed by him all pointed to a depth he hadn't anticipated. As the night wore on, Arthur found himself drawn to the edges of the crowd, his gaze trailing Elena as she moved through the room. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than met the eye, and it wasn't just her composure that intrigued him. It was the way she carried herself, the quiet dignity that seemed to defy the very foundations of his world. By the time the orchestra struck its final note and the guests began to depart, Arthur was no closer to understanding Elena than he had been at the start of the evening. But one thing was certain: she had disrupted the carefully curated order of his gala, and perhaps even his life. As Elena stepped out into the cool night air, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. The evening had been challenging, but she had held her ground. The whispers, the scrutiny, and even Arthur's mockery had not broken her. If anything, they had only strengthened her resolve. She glanced back at the ballroom one last time, its golden glow spilling out onto the street. For a moment, her thoughts lingered on Arthur, the man who had tried to belittle her but had instead revealed his own insecurities. She wondered if he would remember this night as vividly as she would. And then, with a steady breath, she turned and walked away, the whispers fading behind her like distant echoes. The soft glow of dawn filtered through the tall windows of Arthur Belmont's study, casting long shadows over the mahogany furniture and the meticulous rows of leather-bound books. Arthur sat in his high-backed chair, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk before him. His fingers tapped against the wood, a rare sign of unease for a man accustomed to being in control. The events of the previous evening replayed in his mind, each detail sharpening his discomfort. Elena Moreau. Her name lingered like a thorn, and no matter how he turned it over in his mind, he couldn't settle the unease she had stirred. She hadn't just challenged him. She had done so with such quiet certainty that it had unsettled the very foundation of his confidence. He had spent years building his reputation, creating an empire of wealth and influence that few dared to question. Yet this woman, with her modest dress and unshakable poise, had managed to do what few others could. She had exposed his vulnerabilities. "Mr. Belmont," came the voice of his butler, Richard, from the doorway. Arthur turned, his expression hardening instantly. "Your breakfast is ready, sir." "Not now," Arthur said curtly, waving him off. But before Richard could leave, Arthur hesitated. "Actually, bring me the guest list from last night." Richard nodded, disappearing down the hallway. Arthur leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. He needed to know more about her. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why had her presence left such a mark on him? Across town, Elena Moreau sat in a small cafe, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the chatter of early risers. The events of the gala felt distant now, though the intensity of Arthur's scrutiny still lingered in her mind. She had stood her ground, yes, but it had been a battle she hadn't anticipated fighting. "Refill?" asked the waitress, a friendly woman with a tired smile. "Yes, please," Elena replied, offering a small nod of gratitude. As the coffee poured, Elena's thoughts drifted to the atelier, to the days when she had worked under Madame Renaud. Those memories had surfaced during the gala, unbidden but not unwelcome. They reminded her of who she was, of the strength she had cultivated through years of hard work. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her back to the present. A message from Margaret Sinclair, the elegant philanthropist she had met at the gala, lit up the screen. "You left quite an impression last night. I'd like to meet again. Lunch tomorrow?" Elena smiled faintly. Margaret had been one of the few bright spots in an otherwise tense evening. Her support, subtle though it had been, had felt genuine. She typed a quick reply, "I'd be delighted," and set the phone aside. But even as she tried to focus on the warmth of Margaret's message, the weight of Arthur's mockery pressed at the edges of her mind. He had tried to humiliate her, to reduce her to a spectacle, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that his actions had been driven by something deeper than arrogance. There had been an edge to his words, a brittleness that hinted at something unresolved. By mid-morning, Arthur had the guest list in hand, his eyes scanning the names until he found her. Elena Moreau, guest of Mr. and Mrs. Chambers. The Chambers. Of course. They were old money, a family with deep ties to the Belmonts, but little interest in the power plays of the modern elite. That they had invited someone like Elena intrigued Arthur even more. "Richard," Arthur called, his voice sharp. The butler reappeared almost instantly. "Get me everything you can find on Elena Moreau." Richard hesitated, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. "Everything, sir?" "Yes, everything," Arthur snapped. "I want to know who she is, where she came from, and what she wants." Richard bowed slightly before leaving the room, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Arthur leaned forward, steepling his fingers as he stared at the guest list. He didn't know why he was so fixated on her, but the need to uncover her story burned like an itch he couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Elena spent her afternoon in her small workshop, a space filled with bolts of fabric, spools of thread, and the faint scent of lavender sachets tucked into drawers. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could create without judgment. She had opened the workshop a year after the atelier closed, building her reputation slowly through word of mouth. Her clients weren't many, but they were loyal, drawn to the care and precision she poured into every piece. Today, though, her mind wasn't on her work. She sat at her sewing table, the half-finished hem of a gown draped over her lap, her thoughts circling back to Arthur. His words had stung, yes, but what troubled her more was the way he had studied her, as if trying to unravel her very being. A soft knock at the door startled her. Rising, she opened it to find Margaret Sinclair standing there, her emerald green scarf a vibrant contrast to the gray of the city street. "Margaret," Elena said, surprised but pleased. "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." Margaret smiled. "I couldn't wait. May I come in?" "Of course." Elena stepped aside, gesturing for Margaret to enter. As Margaret took in the workshop, her expression softened with admiration. "This is lovely," she said, running her fingers over a swatch of fabric. "I can see why you're so highly regarded." Elena blushed faintly. "It's a modest place, but it suits me." Margaret turned, her gaze suddenly serious. "Elena, I wanted to talk to you about last night. Arthur Belmont isn't someone to be underestimated. He doesn't take well to being challenged." Elena's brow furrowed. "I wasn't trying to challenge him. I only spoke the truth." "Precisely," Margaret said, "and that's why he's unsettled. Men like Arthur build their empires on the illusion of invulnerability. You cracked that illusion, even if only for a moment." Elena considered this, her mind racing with Margaret's words. She had felt the shift in the room when she confronted Arthur, the way the crowd's attention had turned. But she hadn't thought of it as anything more than a fleeting victory. Margaret continued, her tone almost conspiratorial. "If I may offer some advice, tread carefully. Arthur is not a man who lets things go." As night fell, Arthur sat in his study, a folder on his desk filled with the information Richard had compiled. He flipped through the pages, each detail painting a picture of Elena's life. Her years at the atelier, her work with Madame Renaud, the closure of the workshop, and her subsequent efforts to rebuild herself. The more he read, the more his irritation gave way to something else, an uneasy respect. She wasn't just a seamstress. She was an artist, a survivor. And in some ways, she was everything he wasn't. Arthur closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had set out to uncover Elena Moreau, but instead, he had uncovered a reflection of his own shortcomings. And for the first time in a long while, Arthur Belmont felt the faint stirrings of doubt. The grand drawing room of Margaret Sinclair's estate was a study in understated elegance. The deep green walls, lined with bookshelves, gave the space a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold grandeur of Arthur Belmont's ballroom. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, glinting off polished wood and muted gold accents. It was here that Elena found herself the following afternoon, seated across from Margaret with a cup of tea in her hands. "You've stirred up quite the conversation," Margaret began, her tone light but her expression serious. "The buzz about you hasn't stopped since the gala." Elena smiled faintly, taking a sip of tea to mask her unease. "I wasn't trying to make an impression." "Perhaps not," Margaret replied, leaning back in her chair. "But you did. And not just with Arthur. There are people in that room who saw something in you they didn't expect. You reminded them that there's more to value than price tags." Elena tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "You make it sound as if I've started a revolution." Margaret chuckled, her eyes twinkling. "Not quite, but you've made an impact. That's more than most can say after one evening." She set her cup down and leaned forward slightly, her tone softening. "But I have to ask, why did you stay so composed under Arthur's scrutiny? Most would have crumbled, or at least walked away." Elena hesitated, the question pulling her back to memories she rarely revisited. "I've spent years working with people like Arthur," she said finally. "Men who think their wealth entitles them to control every room they enter. At first, it was intimidating, but then I realized something. They rely on that intimidation. When you don't give them what they want, they lose their power." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Wise words. And yet, it seems there's more to your story." "There always is," Elena said with a small smile, though her tone carried a hint of sadness. "But I prefer to let my work speak for itself." Margaret regarded her for a moment, then smiled. "I admire that. And I suspect I'm not the only one." Meanwhile, in the Belmont estate, Arthur sat in his private gallery, a room filled with rare art pieces collected over decades. But his eyes weren't on the paintings or sculptures. Instead, he stared at the fabric samples spread out on the glass coffee table before him. They had been retrieved from Elena's workshop, examples of her craftsmanship brought at his request through quiet channels. The precision of the stitching, the harmony of colors, the sheer artistry of each piece. It was undeniable. He traced a finger over the edge of one sample, feeling the smoothness of the fabric. He hated to admit it, but the work was extraordinary. And for a man like Arthur, whose world revolved around the appearance of perfection, it was a humbling realization. "She's good," he muttered under his breath. "Better than good," said a voice from the doorway. Arthur turned to see his assistant, Richard, standing there, his expression cautious. "I've seen the workshop, sir. It's small, but what she produces there, it's remarkable." Arthur frowned, leaning back in his chair. "So, she's talented. What of it? There are plenty of talented people." "Not like her," Richard said, stepping into the room. "She doesn't just make clothes. She creates something meaningful. You've seen how people reacted to her at the gala. They recognized that, even if they couldn't articulate it." Arthur didn't respond immediately. Instead, he picked up one of the samples, turning it over in his hands. The stitching was flawless, each thread placed with a precision that spoke of years of expertise. It wasn't just skill, it was passion, dedication, the kind of effort that Arthur rarely associated with anyone outside his world. Finally, he set the sample down and looked at Richard. "What's her connection to Margaret Sinclair?" "Margaret's an admirer," Richard replied. "She's commissioned several pieces from Elena over the years. In fact, she was the one who recommended her to the chambers. That's how Elena ended up at the gala." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "So, she didn't just stumble in. She was invited." Richard nodded. "By people who value her work." Arthur leaned back again, his thoughts churning. Elena Moreau was becoming more than a mystery. She was a challenge to everything he thought he understood about value and status. And that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Back at Margaret's estate, the conversation had shifted to lighter topics, but Elena's thoughts remained on Arthur. She couldn't ignore the sense that their encounter had set something in motion, something she couldn't yet define. Margaret must have sensed her distraction because she leaned forward, her expression curious. "What are you thinking, Elena?" Elena hesitated, then sighed. "Arthur Belmont. He's not what I expected." Margaret's smile turned wry. "Few people are. What surprised you?" Elena searched for the right words. "He's trying too hard. It's as if he's constantly performing, proving something, to himself or others. I'm not sure which." Margaret nodded slowly. "That's an astute observation. Arthur has always been complicated. His wealth came easily, through inheritance, but respect? That's something he's been chasing for years." "Respect doesn't come from wealth," Elena said softly. "It comes from character. And therein lies the problem," Margaret replied with a faint smile. "Arthur knows that, but he doesn't know how to embody it." Elena considered this, her thoughts turning back to the gala, to the moments when Arthur's facade had cracked. There had been something in his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability that she hadn't expected. And though she didn't fully understand why, she felt a strange sense of pity for him. Margaret's voice broke through her thoughts. "Whatever happens next, Elena, remember this. You've already shown them who you are. You don't need to prove anything further." Elena smiled, her gratitude evident. "Thank you, Margaret. That means more than you know." As she left the estate that afternoon, Elena felt a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever Arthur Belmont's intentions, she wouldn't let him define her. She had spent too many years building her life on her own terms to let one man's opinion shake her foundation. But as she walked back to her workshop, a lingering thought trailed behind her. What was it about Arthur that made her feel as though their story wasn't finished? The Belmont estate stood as a fortress of opulence, its towering gates and manicured lawns a testament to Arthur Belmont's wealth and influence. But on this particular evening, the grand halls felt unusually tense. Arthur paced the length of his study, his thoughts tangled with the events of the past few days. Despite his efforts to dismiss Elena Moreau as an anomaly, she had managed to occupy more of his thoughts than he cared to admit. He stopped by the fireplace, staring into the flames as they crackled and danced. It wasn't just her defiance or her talent that lingered in his mind. It was the way she had turned his world on its head without raising her voice or lifting a finger. She had challenged his authority, his perception of value, and, perhaps most unsettling of all, his sense of control. "Sir," came Richard's voice from the doorway, pulling Arthur from his thoughts. "The guests are starting to arrive." Arthur turned, his brow furrowing. He had nearly forgotten about the smaller, private gathering he had arranged for this evening. A hand-picked group of investors, associates, and influential figures. It was meant to be a controlled environment, a space where he could reaffirm his standing and shake off the lingering unease from the gala. "Right?" Arthur said, straightening his jacket. "I'll be down shortly." As he descended the grand staircase, the hum of conversation reached his ears. The drawing room was filled with familiar faces, their laughter and chatter a stark contrast to the tension knotting in his chest. He greeted each guest with his practiced charm, slipping effortlessly into the role of the confident host. But his composure wavered when his eyes landed on a figure he hadn't expected to see. Standing near the corner of the room, speaking with Margaret Sinclair, was Elena Moreau. Arthur's breath hitched, though he quickly masked his surprise. He hadn't invited her, of that he was certain. Margaret must have brought her as a guest. And though part of him bristled at the intrusion, another part of him was curious. Why had she come? And what did she hope to gain? Elena felt Arthur's gaze before she saw him. Turning slightly, she met his eyes across the room, her expression calm and unreadable. Margaret, ever perceptive, noticed the exchange and leaned closer. "You've caught his attention again," she murmured with a hint of amusement. "I'm not sure that's a good thing," Elena replied, her tone light but thoughtful. Margaret smiled. "It's neither good nor bad. It simply is. But be careful, Elena. Arthur doesn't take well to being challenged. Elena nodded, her gaze still locked on Arthur as he made his way toward them. His steps were deliberate, his posture stiff with barely concealed tension. When he reached them, he greeted Margaret with a polite nod before turning his attention to Elena. "Ms. Moreau," he said, his tone measured. "I wasn't expecting to see you here tonight." "Nor was I expecting to be here," Elena replied evenly. But Margaret was kind enough to extend an invitation. Arthur's jaw tightened slightly, though he maintained his composure. "How generous of her." Margaret smiled, clearly enjoying the exchange. "I thought Elena might find the evening enlightening." "I'm sure she will," Arthur said, his gaze lingering on Elena. There was something in his eyes, a challenge, perhaps, or a question he wasn't ready to ask aloud. As the evening progressed, Arthur found himself drawn to Elena's presence, even as he tried to resist it. She moved through the room with the same quiet confidence that had unnerved him at the gala, engaging in conversations that seemed to captivate everyone she spoke to. He watched from a distance as she charmed an investor with her knowledge of textiles, then held her own in a debate about artistry versus commerce. It was infuriating, yet fascinating. Arthur prided himself on understanding people, on knowing their motives and vulnerabilities. But Elena remained an enigma. Every attempt he made to unravel her only deepened the mystery. Finally, unable to ignore the pull any longer, he approached her again. This time, she was standing by the fireplace, a glass of wine in her hand. The warm light cast a soft glow on her features, making her seem almost ethereal. "Elena," he said, his voice lower now, almost intimate. "You've certainly made an impression tonight." She turned to him, her expression calm but alert. "That wasn't my intention." "Perhaps not," Arthur said, stepping closer. "But it seems to come naturally to you." They stood in silence for a moment, the crackling of the fire filling the space between them. Then Arthur spoke again, his tone more measured. "I have to admit, your presence here has surprised me. You don't strike me as someone who seeks the spotlight." "I don't," Elena said simply. "But I also don't shy away from it when it finds me." Arthur studied her, his mind racing with questions he couldn't yet voice. Finally, he gestured to the room around them. "You've managed to hold your own among people who would dismiss most outsiders. That's no small feat." "It's not about holding my own," Elena replied. "It's about knowing my worth, regardless of their opinions." Her words struck a chord, and for a brief moment, Arthur felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Admiration, perhaps, or envy. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, one of his associates approached, interrupting the moment. "Arthur, a word," the man said, his tone apologetic but insistent. Arthur hesitated, his gaze lingering on Elena. "Excuse me," he said finally, turning to follow his associate. As he walked away, he felt a strange mix of relief and frustration. Elena Moreau was more than a challenge. She was a disruption, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was unraveling something inside him, something he wasn't ready to face. Meanwhile, Elena watched him go, her expression thoughtful. Margaret's earlier words echoed in her mind. "Be careful. Arthur doesn't take well to being challenged." She had seen the truth in that tonight, but she had also seen something else, a vulnerability beneath his polished exterior. For the first time, Elena wondered if her presence in Arthur's world might serve a purpose greater than she had anticipated. And though she couldn't yet see the full picture, she knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. The Belmont estate was unusually quiet the following evening. The hum of voices and clinking glasses from Arthur's private gathering had long since faded, leaving the house steeped in a silence that felt almost oppressive. Arthur sat in his study, staring at the fire as it crackled softly, the golden light flickering against the dark wood panels. Elena Moreau. Her name lingered in his thoughts like a melody he couldn't shake. No matter how much he tried to dismiss her as an anomaly, she had rooted herself in his mind. It wasn't just her confidence, her refusal to bend beneath his scrutiny. It was something deeper, something he hadn't encountered before. She had seen through him, Not just the man he projected to the world, but the cracks beneath the surface. "Sir," came Richard's voice from the doorway, breaking Arthur's reverie. "You have a visitor." Arthur frowned, his mind still heavy with unanswered questions. "At this hour? Who is it?" "It's Ms. Moreau," Richard replied, his tone carefully neutral. Arthur's heart skipped, though he quickly masked his surprise. "Show her in." Moments later, Elena stepped into the room, her presence calm yet commanding. She wore the same modest confidence that had marked her at the gala, and as she approached, Arthur felt a flicker of unease. He wasn't used to being caught off guard, but Elena had a way of disarming him without saying a word. "Ms. Moreau," Arthur said, rising to greet her. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Elena met his gaze evenly. "I thought it was time we spoke directly, without the audience." Arthur gestured for her to sit, though his curiosity was evident. "A private conversation? I didn't think you were one for intrigue." "I'm not," Elena said, settling into the chair across from him. "But I believe there are things that need to be said." Arthur leaned back, his expression guarded. "By all means then, speak your mind." Elena took a breath, her tone steady but firm. "You've spent the last few days trying to understand me, trying to place me in a category that fits your world. But you can't, because I don't belong to your world. I'm not here to impress you or prove my worth. My worth is not defined by your standards." Arthur's jaw tightened slightly, though he didn't interrupt. Elena's words cut through the pretense he wore like armor, striking at something he couldn't ignore. "You think wealth and status are the measures of success," Elena continued. "But those things are hollow without character. You've built a fortress around yourself, Arthur, but that fortress doesn't make you untouchable. It makes you isolated." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling between them. Arthur stared at her, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't articulate. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "And what would you have me do, Ms. Moreau? Tear down the walls I've spent my life building?" "That's for you to decide," Elena said. "But understand this, true value doesn't come from what you own. It comes from what you give." Arthur's gaze flicked to the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. He had heard variations of these words before, but never with such clarity, never from someone who had nothing to gain from saying them. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "What do you want from me?" Elena's expression softened slightly, though her resolve remained. "I don't want anything from you, Arthur. I came here because I saw something in you at the gala, a man who's more than the image he projects. But that man is buried beneath layers of pride and fear. I thought you deserved to hear the truth, even if it's uncomfortable." Arthur stared at her, the tension in his chest tightening. He had spent his life surrounded by people who flattered and deferred to him, people who fed his ego while keeping their own motives hidden. Elena was the first person in years to speak to him without pretense, and it was both unsettling and strangely liberating. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly, its warmth filling the room as Arthur processed her words. Finally, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and met her gaze directly. "You're not like anyone I've met before, Elena," he said, his tone more sincere than she had ever heard. "You've challenged me in ways I didn't expect, and I don't know whether to thank you or curse you for it." Elena's lips curved into a faint smile. "Perhaps you should start by listening to what the challenge is telling you." Arthur let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "And here I thought I had all the answers." "None of us do," Elena said gently, "but we can choose to seek them." The conversation lingered in the air, its impact undeniable. For the first time in years, Arthur felt the faint stirrings of humility, a recognition that his wealth and power had not shielded him from his own shortcomings. As Elena rose to leave, she paused by the door, glancing back at him. "One last thing, Mr. Belmont," she said. "You have more to offer this world than you realize. But that depends on what kind of man you choose to be." Arthur nodded slowly, her words echoing in his mind as she walked out of the room. He sat there for a long time after she left, the fire's warmth doing little to ease the chill of self-reflection. By the time he finally retired for the night, Arthur Belmont knew one thing for certain. Elena Moreau had left an indelible mark on his life. And though he didn't yet know what he would do with the lesson she had offered, he understood that he could no longer ignore it. The morning broke over the city with a quiet serenity, the kind of stillness that precedes a significant shift. At the Belmont estate, Arthur sat by the window of his study, the light casting long shadows across the room. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the words Elena Moreau had left him with the previous night. True value doesn't come from what you own. It comes from what you give. The phrase clung to him like a stubborn melody, refusing to fade. He had built his entire life on acquisitions of wealth, power, and status, believing that those things would cement his place in the world. And yet, for all his achievements, he felt a hollowness that he couldn't explain, one that Elena's words had brought into stark relief. He glanced at the folder on his desk, its contents a detailed account of Elena's life. He had ordered the report to understand her, to find leverage if necessary. But now, the pages seemed to mock him, a reminder of how far he had fallen into the habits of control and manipulation. He saw her struggles, her resilience, her unwavering dedication to her craft. And he saw, with uncomfortable clarity, how little he truly understood about what it meant to build something meaningful. The sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled him from his thoughts. Richard appeared in the doorway, his expression hesitant. "Sir, the staff has been asking about the changes you mentioned for the upcoming charity auction. They need confirmation on the direction you'd like to take." Arthur frowned, his mind taking a moment to catch up. The charity auction was one of his annual events, a highly publicized affair meant to showcase his generosity while reinforcing his status. But now, the idea of parading his wealth in such a superficial manner felt wrong. "Tell them to hold off for now," Arthur said, his tone quieter than usual. "I need to rethink the approach." Richard nodded, though his brow furrowed slightly. "Very well, sir." As the butler left, Arthur leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. For years, his charity events had been more about appearances than impact, a way to maintain his image rather than affect meaningful change. But now, the very concept of charity seemed to carry a different weight, a potential to give, not just to display. Meanwhile, across town, Elena was in her workshop, her hands steady as she guided fabric through a sewing machine. The rhythmic hum of the needle was a comfort, a familiar sound that grounded her amidst the whirlwind of recent events. She had spent the morning reflecting on her conversation with Arthur, wondering if her words had reached him. She hadn't gone to the Belmont estate to lecture him, but something about their interactions had compelled her to speak her truth. "Elena," came a voice from the doorway. Margaret Sinclair stepped inside, her presence as poised as ever. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Elena said, looking up with a smile. "Come in." Margaret took a seat near the work table, her gaze scanning the room with genuine interest. "I wanted to see you before I left for my trip. And, if I'm honest, I was curious about how things went with Arthur last night." Elena hesitated, her fingers pausing on the fabric. "It was unexpected," she admitted. "I didn't plan to confront him, but I couldn't leave without saying what I felt needed to be said." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "And how did he take it?" "I'm not sure," Elena said. "He listened, which I didn't expect. But whether it made an impact, I can't say." Margaret smiled faintly. "You may not see it immediately, but I suspect you've planted a seed. Arthur isn't a man who changes easily, but he's not immune to reason. Or to truth." Elena returned her smile, though doubt lingered in her mind. She had done what she could, but the rest was beyond her control. For now, all she could do was focus on her work, the one constant in her life. That evening, the Belmont estate hosted another gathering, though this one was markedly different from Arthur's usual affairs. The attendees were not the city's elite, but a mix of artists, entrepreneurs, and philanthropists, people who, like Elena, had built their lives on passion and purpose rather than wealth alone. Elena had been surprised to receive the invitation, hand-delivered with a note in Arthur's handwriting. "I believe there's more for us to discuss. Your insight would be valuable." She had debated attending, but ultimately decided to go. If Arthur was genuinely trying to change, she wanted to see it for herself. When she arrived, the atmosphere was unlike anything she had experienced at his previous events. The grand ballroom had been transformed, its usual displays of opulence replaced with exhibits showcasing local artisans and their work. Guests mingled, admiring paintings, sculptures, and textiles, while live music played softly in the background. "Elena," Arthur's voice called from across the room. He approached her, his demeanor more subdued than she remembered. He extended a hand, his expression earnest. "Thank you for coming." She shook his hand, her gaze studying him carefully. "This is unexpected." Arthur smiled faintly. "That seems to be a theme with us." As they walked through the room, Arthur explained his vision for the evening. He had invited local artists and entrepreneurs to showcase their work, offering them a platform to connect with patrons and expand their reach. The proceeds from the event would go toward funding creative initiatives in underserved communities. "I realized that my charity events weren't really about giving," Arthur said, his tone reflective. "They were about me, and that needed to change." Elena listened, her skepticism giving way to a cautious sense of respect. Arthur was far from perfect, but he was trying, a rare quality in someone who had spent a lifetime avoiding self-reflection. As the evening progressed, Elena found herself drawn into conversations with other guests, sharing stories and exchanging ideas. For the first time, she felt that she truly belonged in a space that had once seemed so distant from her world. By the end of the night, as the last guests trickled out and the lights dimmed, Arthur approached Elena once more. They stood near the entrance, the quiet of the room amplifying the significance of the moment. "I want to thank you," Arthur said, his voice steady but sincere. "Not just for coming tonight, but for everything. You've challenged me in ways I didn't expect, and it's forced me to see things differently." Elena met his gaze, her own expression softening. "The challenge wasn't mine to give, Arthur. It was always yours to take." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Still, I'm grateful." As Elena left the estate that night, she felt a sense of closure she hadn't anticipated. Arthur Belmont was a man in transition, and while his journey was far from complete, she had played a small part in steering him toward a better path. For the first time in years, she walked away from the world of wealth and power not as an outsider, but as someone who had left an indelible mark. And as the cool night air embraced her, she realized that her worth had never been tied to the opinions of others. It had always been her own to define.